In the autumn of 1886, on a stretch of open grass west of the James River in Dakota Territory, a man named Ingvar Solberg cut a rectangle into the side of a low rise and began digging his house into the earth. He had come from a valley in Norway where the winters were long and the snow was measured in meters, not inches, and where his father and his father's father had kept sheep on hillsides too steep for anything but grass. He had brought that knowledge with him across an ocean and half a continent, though by the time he reached Dakota Territory, he had almost nothing else. His wife, Solveig, had died of a fever 11 months earlier, 6 weeks after their ship put in at New York, before either of them had seen the land they had crossed an ocean for. He had filed the claim anyway, alone, because the alternative was going back to a valley that no longer had anything in it for him. The neighbors who had already proved up their claims built the way the land agents and the lumber catalogs told them to build. A rectangle of milled or hand-hewn timber, walls a single board thick, a stove in the middle, and a roof steep enough to shed snow. It was the shape of a house that made sense in Ohio or Pennsylvania or wherever the pattern had come from, and on the open prairie with wind that had nothing to slow it down for hundreds of miles. It was a shape that let the cold walk straight through the walls. Ingvar did not build that way. He cut his rectangle 4 feet down into the rise, so that the floor of his house sat below the frost line, and the earth itself, thick and slow to change temperature, formed 3 of his 4 walls. Above ground, he built a second wall 6 inches outside the first, not touching it, and packed the gap between them with dry prairie grass bundled into fists and laid crosswise, the way a man might layer shingles, so that no single gap ran straight through from outside to in. Over that he troweled a mixture of clay-heavy mud and chopped grass, the same wattle and daub method used in cottages across northern Europe for centuries, and let it dry hard in the September sun. For the roof he did something his neighbors found stranger still. He sheared the wool from the 6 sheep he had managed to keep alive through the crossing and the first summer, carded it loose rather than spinning it, and packed it a foot thick between 2 layers of sod, held apart by a lattice of willow branches cut from the river bank. A settler named Otto Kruger, who had the timber claim nearest to Ingvar's, rode over one October afternoon to see what the Norwegian was building, and stood at the top of the cut looking down into it with an expression that was not unkind, only baffled. "You're building a bird's nest," Kruger said. "Grass and wool and mud. Ingvar, a hard freeze will go through that like it isn't there." Ingvar did not argue. He was not a man who argued. 11 months of grief had worn most of the talk out of him. He said only that the sheep in his valley had wintered on hillsides in weather that killed cattle, and that they had done it standing in nothing but their own wool, and that wool did not stop being wool because it had crossed an ocean. Kruger rode back to his own half-finished timber house unconvinced, and told his wife that their neighbor had grief sitting on him, so heavy he had started building like a prairie dog instead of a man. The story went around the township the way stories do in a place with few people and long winters to fill with talk. By the time the first snow came in November, most of the families within a day's ride knew about the Norwegian's dugout, and most of them had decided, without much unkindness in it, that he had gone a little strange since his wife died. They were not wrong that he had changed. They were wrong about what the change meant. Ingvar's first attempt at the double wall failed before it ever saw snow. He had packed the grass between the walls loosely, the way a man handles hay he intends to feed out later, and a week of autumn rain worked its way down through the gaps and soaked the bundles through. When he opened a section of the outer wall to check it, the grass had gone gray and matted, pressed flat by its own wet weight, and the dead-air space he had built the whole design around had collapsed into a single damp mass that held cold instead of holding still air. He understood, standing there with wet grass in his hands, that the insulation had never been the grass itself. It was the pockets of unmoving air trapped inside and between the stalks, the same principle that let a live sheep's fleece keep the animal warm through a Norwegian winter, while a wet, matted fleece did nothing at all. Air that could not move could not carry heat away quickly. Air that was free to circulate, or grass packed so wet and dense it left no air at all, defeated the whole purpose. He tore the ruined section out and rebuilt it in December cold instead of October damp, working in short spells, because his hands would only stay warm for 20 minutes at a stretch before he had to go inside and hold them over the stove. This time he packed the grass drier and looser, letting the bundles keep their shape instead of crushing them flat, and he covered the outer wall with a final coat of mud before the first heavy snow so that no more rain could reach the grass at all. When he judged the wall finished, he drove a thin iron rod through it at 3 points and left the holes open for a day, then held his palm to each hole in turn. Where the wall was working, he felt almost nothing, a faint give of air but no draft. At one spot near the northeast corner, he felt a thin, cold thread moving against his skin, and he dug that section open again and found a place where the grass bundles had been laid with their stalks running the same direction as the wall's height instead of crossing it, leaving a straight channel for wind to find. He relayed it crosswise and sealed it, and the draft stopped. The roof gave him a different kind of trouble. He had judged the depth of wool by guess rather than by any measure, and when the first real cold arrived in the second week of December, a night that dropped to 11 degrees below zero, he woke to find frost forming on the inside of the roof directly above where his cookfire sat. The heat rising from the fire was warming the air near the roof enough that moisture in it was condensing and freezing against the underside of the sod, in a spot where the wool below had thinned to only 4 or 5 inches because he had run short of fleece by the time he reached that corner. He had shorn only 6 sheep, and 6 sheep had not been enough animal to insulate the whole roof of a house. He solved it the way a man solves a problem when he has already spent the resource he needed. He moved the cookfire 18 inches to the side, out from directly under the thin patch, and packed the gap that remained with dried cattail down gathered from the sloughs along the river, which trapped air nearly as well as wool and cost him nothing but 3 cold mornings of gathering. By the turn of the year, Ingvar Solberg's dugout held a small, patient warmth that a single armload of buffalo grass hay, burned slow in an earthen firebox he had built into the thickest part of the north wall, could sustain through a night. His neighbors' timber houses, by contrast, were burning through cordwood at a rate that worried every man in the township, because The single-thickness board walls let heat pass through them almost as fast as the stoves could produce it, and a north wind against a plank wall stole warmth the way a hand pulled heat from a metal cup. The blizzard came in the third week of January, out of a sky that had been strangely still and yellow-gray for 2 days beforehand, the kind of stillness the older Dakota settlers said to watch for. It did not announce itself gradually. Otto Kruger was out at his woodpile in the early afternoon when the wind came around from the northwest so fast and so hard that the temperature, by his own thermometer, dropped almost 30 degrees in under an hour, and the snow that had been falling gently turned within minutes into a horizontal wall of white that erased his barn from view, though it stood only 60 feet from his door. He got back inside by keeping one hand on the rope he had, out of old habit, strung between the house and the barn that morning, a habit that likely saved his life. The storm did not let go for 3 weeks. It broke twice, briefly, long enough to convince a few desperate men that it was over before it closed back down on them, and each of those false breaks cost the township something. A young man from a homestead 6 miles north went out during the second lull to check on cattle and was found 4 days later, less than 200 yards from his own door, having lost the line of a fence in a whiteout that returned faster than he could see it coming. Wood ran out in 3 of the timber houses before the second week was through. Families burning furniture and then fence posts pried out of the drifted snow. And the Kruger family, in a well-built cabin with a good stove, still watched their woodpile disappear at a rate that told Otto Kruger, doing the arithmetic by lamplight on the 9th night, that they would not make it to the end of the storm on what remained. Ingvar Solberg came up out of his dugout on the 10th day, during the second false lull, wearing every layer of wool he owned and moving along a line of stakes he had driven into the ground the previous autumn precisely for this purpose, a line that ran from his door to the Kruger claim a half-mile off. He had burned through less than a third of his winter's hay. His dugout, 4 feet under the frost line with wool and dead grass around it, had held a temperature through the worst of the storm that let him keep a fire only twice a day, and still wake each morning to water that had not frozen in the bucket by his bed. He had time and fuel to spare, and he had spent some of it building, in the strange quiet after the wind first began to lift. A sledge loaded with hay bundled the way he had once bundled it for his father's sheep, packed dense enough to hold together and light enough to pull. He reached the Kruger house as the second wave of the storm was visibly building on the horizon behind him, a second wall of gray-white climbing the sky faster than a man could outrun it. He did not knock so much as put his shoulder against the door and call through it. Otto Kruger opened it to a man rimed white to the eyebrows, dragging a sledge of hay bundles and carrying, slung over one shoulder, a second, smaller bundle of raw fleece he had sheared early for exactly this use. There was no long conversation. Kruger's own children were cold enough by then that his pride, whatever remained of it, had already gone out with the last of his firewood. Ingvar showed him, in the few minutes they had before the wind found them again, how to pack the fleece into the worst gaps around the Kruger cabin's door and window frames, stuffing it in tight fistfuls the same way he had packed his walls, and how to bank the outer wall with the snow itself, which, packed and left undisturbed, could hold still air nearly as well as the wool did, so long as no wind was allowed to move through it. It was not a fix that made the Kruger cabin into a dugout. It was a fix that bought the family time, and it worked because the principle underneath it was the same one Ingvar had spent his whole autumn learning by failure. Cold does not come from outside a wall so much as it comes from moving air finding a way through it. And anything, wool or grass or snow itself, that stopped the air from moving stopped most of the cold with it. The second wave of the storm closed over both households before Ingvar could get back to his own claim, and he spent the remaining 11 days of the blizzard in the Kruger cabin, sharing what hay remained on his sledge, keeping the packed gaps tended, and teaching Otto Kruger's oldest boy how to read the sound of wind against a gap that needed repacking, a thin whistling note distinct from the general roar. The Kruger family's woodpile, stretched by a stuffed and snow-banked wall instead of a bare board one, lasted to the end of the storm with 4 days of fuel still standing when the sky finally cleared in the second week of February. When the wind dropped for good, the township took stock of what it had cost. 2 men had died in the false lulls. Cattle losses ran into the hundreds across the district. 3 families had burned every piece of spare wood and furniture they owned and were still, by the accounts that circulated afterward, within a day or two of a much worse outcome when the storm finally broke. The Kruger family had not lost a single animal past the barn wall Ingvar had helped them rebank on his second trip back out, once the weather allowed it, and their own account of how close they had come without him was not one Otto Kruger told lightly, and not one he told the same way twice, because each retelling seemed to cost him something to admit. By spring, 3 other families on the north side of the township had cut their own dugouts into rises on their claims, packed with dry grass, sealed with mud, and roofed with whatever wool or down they could gather, not because a bird's nest had suddenly become fashionable, but because they had spent 3 weeks in January learning, the hard way, the difference between a wall that merely stood between a person and the weather and a wall that actually stopped the weather from moving through it. Otto Kruger was not among the 3 who dug that spring. His timber cabin was already built, and his family's roots too set to start over. But he cut a length of grass from the same slough Ingvar had gathered cattail down from the winter before, dried it properly this time by his own hand, and packed it into every remaining gap in his own walls before the following November. And he never again called his neighbor's house a bird's nest, not because he had been shamed out of the word, but because he had come to understand, from 3 weeks of counting his own dwindling woodpile, exactly what the nest had been built to do, and why a bird that lived through a hard winter had never needed anyone's opinion of its house to be right about it.